On that silent morning in a small American town, no one could have predicted the terror that was about to engulf the main street. An explosion shook the windows of the houses, sending smoke and panic everywhere. Amidst the chaos, a woman ran desperately out of her burning house, dressed only in her nightclothes, her face etched with the horror of someone struggling between life and death. Behind her, however, remained what she held most precious, her 3-year-old son, trapped between the walls that were giving way to the fire. Fate seemed to have already written the end for that innocent child, until, in a moment of providence, a soldier walking down the street heard the muffled screams inside the house. The sound of a life about to be lost made him fight against his instinct for self-preservation. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He entered the flaming inferno to try to snatch the boy from the clutches of death. The scorching heat consumed the air, the walls trembled, ready to collapse, and each second felt like a final sentence. The mother, kneeling on the sidewalk, screamed for her son, unable to bring herself to go back inside. The stunned neighbors watched, unsure if the soldier who had walked through the smoke would make it out alive. Inside the house, the boy's cries mingled with the crackling of falling timbers, as if time were being counted in bursts of fire. The soldier, his face covered in soot, advanced almost blindly, guided only by the sound of that frail voice. But fate exacts a heavy toll on those who defy death. If they saved the child, who could guarantee they would make it out in one piece? Outside, everyone waited, poised between hope and tragedy, until a figure appeared in the smoke. If this story has already caught your attention, leave your like now and subscribe to follow it until the end. On that calm morning, the neighborhood seemed to be going about its normal routine, with neighbors preparing coffee, children still drowsy in front of the television, and the timid sun illuminating the nearly deserted streets. It was just another ordinary day in a small American town where rarely anything extraordinary happened. However, fate often chooses the quietest places to write its most violent stories. And so, in a matter of seconds, the silence of the street was shattered by a deafening roar. The explosion shook windows, scattered shrapnel across the sidewalk, and sent up a cloud of smoke that hid the facade of a previously anonymous house. The fire spread with voracious speed, licking walls, swallowing furniture, and turning the lives of an entire family to ashes before the astonished eyes of those who witnessed the scene. The first to emerge from the smoke was a woman. Barefoot, her hair disheveled and her eyes wide with panic, she could barely comprehend what had just happened. She was alive, but in shock. Her body trembled, and as she realized the gravity of the situation, her breathing became uncontrollable sobs. With her nightclothes clinging to her skin, she ran to the sidewalk for air, unaware that she had left behind something no mother's heart should forget: her son. Only when a child's thin, distressed voice echoed between the burning walls did her terror turn to absolute despair. The boy was only 3 years old. 3 years of innocence trapped amidst the chaos. The fire roared like a living animal, the smoke made the air unbreathable, and with each passing second, the house became a death trap. The woman fell to her knees on the hot asphalt, screaming for her son, but she couldn't move inside. Her body refused to return to the hell she had just escaped. Neighbors began to approach, some with tears in their eyes, others unsure of what to do in the face of the tragedy unfolding before them. It was as if everyone was hoping for a miracle, but no one dared cross the wall of fire. And it was at that moment that fate placed a man in that family's path. A soldier, uniformed only with memories and invisible marks, passed by on the street. He wasn't there by chance, but neither was he seeking to be a hero. His steps were firm, but his soul carried the weight of the battles he had fought in distant lands. Hearing the child's screams, something in his heart flared. He didn't need to think twice. His life had always been shaped by the instinct to protect, to face danger when everyone else retreated. His eyes fixed on the burning house, and the world around him faded. The fear that paralyzed the others didn't stop him. He ran toward the smoke, while his stunned mother tried to hold him by the arm, begging him not to enter. But the decision had already been made. There was an innocent life inside, and a soldier's life marked by sacrifice seemed always destined for those moments when the impossible needed to be challenged. In that instant, between the fire consuming the house and a mother's shattered heart, a story began to unfold that would never be forgotten by anyone on that street. The clock seemed to speed up, as if each second were the last, and the line between salvation and tragedy narrowed with each crackle of the burning wood. And as the crowd held its breath, a single man disappeared into the smoke, taking with him the hope of all who watched. Within the suffocating smoke, as he advanced blindly in search of the boy, memories that had never left him began to pulse through his mind. This soldier was not just an ordinary man facing the fire. He was someone scarred by battles that had robbed him of sleep and given him a cruel familiarity with the smell of smoke, destruction, and fear. His name was Michael Donovan, a war veteran, decorated for bravery, but haunted by the invisible shadows he brought home. Michael had served for years in conflicts most people only knew about through television screens. In distant deserts, he had carried the weight of wounded comrades on his back, hearing the same desperate screams that now echoed in that American home. It was as if the past had returned to test him again. He remembered the explosions that turned buildings to dust, the sound of helicopters cutting through the sky, and the empty looks of civilians who lost everything in a matter of seconds. He had always been trained to protect, to save, to put the lives of others above his own. But this training had not shielded him from the invisible scars. Upon returning to the United States, he felt his war was not over. The memories haunted him like ghosts, and each day felt like a minefield within his own mind. Yet it was precisely this past that now compelled him not to retreat. While many saw the fire as an insurmountable barrier, he saw it as just another battle, another enemy to be defeated. Sweat dripped down his face, mixing with the soot, but his steps didn't falter. He knew what fear was, but he also knew what it was to leave someone behind, and that was something he promised himself he would never do again. Outside, the mother sobbed helplessly, unable to stand. Her son's name escaped her lips in heartbreaking pleas. The neighbors, motionless, saw in the soldier an unlikely hope, an almost unreal figure who walked through the flames as if born for it. And in a way, there was. For though he had returned from the war with invisible scars, Michael carried with him an unshakable conviction. A child's life was always sacred, and no flame, no matter how fierce, could be stronger than his determination. Each step inside that destroyed house brought back memories of carrying bloodied children out of the rubble of devastated villages. The voices of the past mingled with the boy's present. War had taught him to endure the unbearable, but it had also taught him not to ignore life's call. It was as if all the years of pain and sacrifice were converging on that single moment in that quiet neighborhood before a woman weeping for her son's life. Michael knew he might not make it out alive. But for him, dying trying to save someone was always better than living with the guilt of not having tried. The weight of his invisible uniform, already tucked away in the closet, still guided every choice. And now, even without weapons, without equipment, without a shield, he was once again the soldier fate had summoned for one last battle, rescuing an innocent boy from the deadly embrace of fire. The interior of the house was a veritable labyrinth of fire. With every step Michael took, the floor creaked as if about to give way under his weight. The air was dense, heavy, an invisible poison that burned his lungs with every breath. The smoke blurred everything, transforming furniture into grotesque shapes and shadows into threats. He knew he had little time. In a few minutes the walls would crumble, and nothing would remain but ash. Still, he pressed on, guided by the fragile sound that insisted on piercing the chaos, a child's cry. The little boy screamed, calling for his mother, his thin voice echoing like a beacon in the midst of hell. Michael closed his eyes for a moment, trying to orient himself solely by the direction of the sounds, ignoring the heat that burned his skin as if it were being consumed. The cracking of the wood was deafening, and pieces of ceiling were already beginning to fall, scattering sparks across the floor, which was turning into embers. The soldier covered his face with his forearm, shielding himself from the suffocating heat, and crawled through corridors engulfed in flames. In his mind, every detail evoked scenes he had experienced elsewhere. He remembered entering bomb-ravaged houses in foreign villages, where every corner hid not only the risk of collapse, but also the threat of imminent death. Now back home, the scene was not much different. The war had moved into that living room, that bedroom, that innocent life crying out for help. He found the child's room. The door was ajar, but a burning beam had fallen directly in front of him, blocking the passage. Michael kicked the debris hard, ignoring the burns on his skin. On the other side, the boy's voice rang out even clearer, amidst desperate sobs. Michael knew he had to act quickly. Every second he lost felt like a nearing sentence. He shoved the burning wood aside with his shoulder, feeling the sting seep into his bones. And then, finally, he could see the small figure huddled in a corner of the room, hugging a charred stuffed toy, eyes wide with terror. The child trembled, unsure if the figure emerging from the smoke was a monster or an angel. Michael knelt, trying to soften his voice, though his throat was torn from the smoke. "It's going to be okay, little one. I'm here to get you out of here," he whispered, even though he knew the child might be too young to understand. Still, the firmness in his tone seemed to offer a modicum of reassurance. The heat was unbearable, and the ceiling was beginning to cave in. A piece of plaster fell inches from Michael, nearly hitting the child. He quickly wrapped his arms around her, covering her with his own body, as he had so often done with wounded soldiers in the field. The little boy sobbed, burying his face in his chest, as Michael lifted him with all his remaining strength. But the way back would not be simple. The house was becoming a death trap, every hallway now blocked by debris, every second reducing the chance of survival. Michael clutched the child to his chest, feeling the fragility of a body so small it could be lost in a puff of smoke. He couldn't fail. Not here. Not with this boy who was only 3 years old and had a whole story ahead of him. It was as if the entire universe had conspired to put him on that street, at that time, at that moment. And he knew that, if necessary, he would give his own life to ensure that little heart kept beating. With the boy in his arms, Michael felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. It wasn't the physical weight, for the child was light, almost insignificant compared to his strength. It was the symbolic weight, the absolute responsibility of ensuring that little one survived. The heat burned his back as if the fire had hands, pushing him against the walls. Every hallway was a threat, every crack in the ceiling a warning that the seconds were numbered. He looked around, trying to piece together the structure of the house he barely knew. The smoke made it impossible to distinguish doors from walls, and the charred furniture became treacherous obstacles. Michael was breathing heavily, swallowing more smoke than air, while the child's heart pounded against his chest. The boy was no longer crying. He was in such a deep state of shock that he only sobbed softly, clutching the burned stuffed toy tightly. Michael knew the main exit was blocked. The path he had entered had already been taken by fire, devouring every inch of the hallway. He considered trying through the window, but the windows were sealed with ancient iron bars, impossible to break without tools. The dilemma loomed: risk an impossible return, or find another route that might not even exist. His instincts screamed at him to decide quickly, because the house was alive, creaking, groaning, as if it were about to collapse on top of them. As he pondered, a piece of ceiling broke off and struck his shoulder, opening a gash that bled immediately. The pain was sharp but insignificant compared to the urgency. Michael shifted the boy in his arms, protecting him, and moved forward, guided by the memory of sounds and instinct honed by years of combat. He knew that just as on a battlefield, when the siege seemed complete, the only chance of survival lay in finding a gap no one else could see. Sweat ran into his eyes, mixed with soot. His muscles burned, but his mind remained focused. "I won't leave you behind," he repeated silently to the child as if it were an oath. It was more than saving a boy. It was facing the ghosts of past battles, where he had often failed to save everyone. Now here in that burning house, he had a chance at redemption. The sound of the fire was deafening, a constant roar that drowned out everything. With each step, Michael felt closer to an invisible boundary between life and death. He knew he might not make it out, but the dilemma was no longer between living and dying. It was between ensuring the child's life or failing in the only duty that mattered at that moment. For a man like him, there was no choice. Slowly, the sight of a side door began to emerge through the thick smoke. It was an exit to the backyard, a chance. But between him and the door, burning debris blocked the way. Michael looked at the boy, looked at the fire, and knew he had no time to hesitate. Either he faced the flames, or they would both become part of the ashes that would soon engulf the entire house. Outside, the scene was no less devastating. The mother, kneeling on the asphalt sidewalk, trembled from head to toe, unable to stand. Her disheveled hair was plastered to her sweaty face, and her torn nightgown gave her a look of utter abandonment. Her eyes, red and lost, stared at the door of the burning house as if, with the strength of her gaze, they could bring back the son she had left behind. With every second, her chest heaved with sobs of despair, mixed with a scream that could no longer escape her throat. She remembered the moment of the explosion clearly. The deafening noise, the sudden heat that enveloped her, the smoke that filled her lungs and made her instinctively run for her life. In her rush to save herself, she hadn't realized her son was still trapped inside. Only when she was on the sidewalk, breathing heavily, did she hear the child's thin, distant cry. And it was at that moment that her mind was overcome by the crushing weight of guilt. How could a mother forget her own son? The dilemma consumed her like a second flame burning inside. Neighbors began to gather around her, but no one dared enter the house. An older man desperately called the fire department, repeating the address loudly, while others watched in silence with expressions of panic and helplessness. Some women tried to comfort the mother, placing their hands on her shoulders, but she turned away, shaking her head, unable to accept any gesture of comfort. Her eyes, brimming with tears, searched only for the figure of the soldier who had disappeared into the smoke. "He came in. He came in to save my son," she repeated like a mantra, trying to believe there was still hope. But her voice was so fragile, it sounded more like a prayer than a statement. With each louder crack from inside the house, she shuddered, as if it were the final sentence. Cruel images formed in her mind, the ceiling collapsing on the boy, the fire consuming the toys, the little boy calling for her until his voice died. Guilt tore her apart, making it impossible to look the neighbors in the eye, witnessing her torment. The silence of the street was broken only by the roar of the flames and the muffled screams from inside the house. Some residents wept, others prayed quietly, forming a circle of tension around the spectacle of tragedy. Everyone knew that if it weren't for that unknown soldier, the boy would already be lost, and yet hope was tenuous, like a candle about to burn out. Amidst the chaos, the mother brought her hands to her face and fell face down to the ground, sobbing in despair. Her voice, almost unrecognizable, whispered her son's name in an incessant call, as if trying to reach him through the fire. The weight of her failure crushed her, turning every second into an eternity. There was no greater pain than feeling guilty for the possible loss of her own blood, and yet there was also a strange feeling growing in her heart. Between the guilt and despair, a spark of gratitude emerged for the stranger who had risked his life to make amends for her failure. She knew she would never be able to look that soldier in the eye the way she looked at anyone else, because, in a way she couldn't yet comprehend, he already carried within him part of her family's fate. With each shallow breath, the smoke seemed to open ancient doors within him. Michael walked through the blazing hallway with the boy clutched to his chest, and suddenly the cracking of the ceiling sounded like distant gunshots. The roar of the fire sounded like propellers tearing through the desert sky where, years before, he had learned to swallow his fear to save those who couldn't run. His palm burned as he touched the glowing doorknob, and that burning brought back a day when he had dragged an injured comrade down a narrow alley under a shower of dust and glass, repeating a mantra he now whispered in the child's ear. "You'll be okay. I promise." The sweet smell of burning plastic and fabric mingled with an ancient one, that of fresh paint in a makeshift shelter where he had held a little girl in his arms, waiting for a father who never arrived. He remembered the frightened look, the small hand clutching the pocket of his uniform, and the silent vow he had made that afternoon: never leave a little one behind. The walls creaked like ribs about to break. Michael judged distances by feel, as he had when an explosion knocked out lights and signals, leaving only the memory of the map etched into his body. 3 steps, he crouches. 4 steps, shoulder against the wall. 2 to the left, he searches for cooler air near the ground. The boy sobbed, "Mama," a word that cut through Michael's chest like shrapnel and at the same time served as a compass. That simple request reminded him of letters he'd received from his sister, filled with children's drawings, birthdays he'd missed, cakes he'd never tasted because he was too far away, always on a front line that wouldn't let him rest. I'm here now, he thought, and the thought became strength. There was no decoration worth more than the light weight of that head resting on his chest. A louder crack, a whole body of the ceiling came crashing down, and he threw himself sideways, shielding the child with his torso. The shock knocked the wind out of him, his vision flashed black, and it was the sergeant's voice, stored in the depths of his memory, that pulled him back. If there's no way out, make one. Michael rose with pain and rage, strode through the heat with gritted teeth, and began to improvise the impossible. He pushed a fallen bookshelf until it rested against a cracked windowsill. He made a crooked bridge over a sea of embers that the house had become. He ripped open a half-melted curtain with a yank and wrapped it around the boy like one wrapping a fragile gift. He tucked the ends under his chin, turning his body into a shield. The fabric smoked, but it was enough of a barrier to buy seconds, and seconds here were the very definition of a miracle. His knees hit a charred doorframe. On the other side, the air was a little cooler, a sign of a yard, a sign of light. Michael leaned his forehead against the wood, recalling a memory that only surfaced when the night fell. The empty chaplaincy tent, the creaking of the canvas in the wind, the row of dog tags hanging silently like a corridor of silent bells. That day, after a rescue gone wrong, he had tied his own tag to a shoelace, swearing it would only return to his neck with the weight of victory. Now, he felt the cold metal brush against his wrist, an old habit, and realized the promise had no deadline, only direction. The past, with its dead and missing, didn't ask for explanations. It asked him to carry the living to the light. "Look at me, champion," he murmured, knowing the boy would understand his tone more than his words. "We're going to find heaven." And heaven there was a whitish rectangle shimmering at the end of a corridor that was no longer a corridor, but a dragon's throat. He tested the floor with his boot, felt the elastic yield of the boards, mentally mapped out a path that seemed like absurd arithmetic. 3 supports, push off, shallow breath, shoulder first, the boy always high without inhaling the smoke. Memories no longer paralyzed him, they were tools. Each old scene brought a learned gesture, a decision that had already been made in another time, in a nameless place. The body remembered before the mind. The side door handle was heat-welded. Michael took a half-step back, braced his feet, imagined the worn hinge, and reached the perfect height with his shoulder. The wood groaned, split and split open, allowing a thin stream of wind to enter, smelling of burnt grass and freedom. The cold air hit his face like water, and the boy opened his eyes for a moment, staring at the light as if recognizing the miracle. Michael smiled toothlessly, a smile somewhere between pain and stubbornness that always brought him back. Outside, distant voices approached, sirens sketching a promise on the horizon. He pushed his body through the gap, still half enclosed by the bent frame, and for the first time since entering the fire, he felt the past finally give way to the present. The world outside called, but the house, proud and furious, rehearsed its final collapse behind him, and the next move would have to be perfect. The entire street was already engulfed. Neighbors who had previously watched in shock now formed a semicircle around the burning house, like unwitting spectators of a cruel spectacle. The sirens still echoed in the distance, promises of help that seemed never to arrive. The heat made the air ripple, and smoke rose thickly, tinging the sky grey as if the tragedy were too great to be contained within a single block. With each loud crack from inside, everyone shuddered, certain that this was the moment the house would finally give way. The mother, kneeling, her face buried in her hands, she repeated her son's name as if in prayer, her broken voice mixing with the sobs that escaped her uncontrollably. Some women approached to try to console her, but no words seemed enough. Everyone's eyes searched for the same thing, the figure of the soldier who, minutes before, had disappeared into the smoke, carrying the family's only hope. Some neighbors tried to organize themselves. One brought a bucket of water, another appeared with a short hose connected to a faucet, but the fire seemed to mock their efforts, growing with a force that consumed everything. A white-haired man leaning on a cane murmured a prayer aloud, asking God to spare the child. Beside him, 2 teenagers filmed the scene with cell phones, but even they, who had begun recording reflexively, sensed the gravity of the situation and lowered their devices, unable to continue in the face of the imminent tragedy. Every face in that crowd carried the same mix of feelings: fear, helplessness, hope, and a strange admiration for the man who had dared to enter. Many had heard of soldiers risking their lives on battlefields, but few expected to see such courage in their own neighborhood on an ordinary morning. It was as if this man suddenly represented the last spark of humanity remaining in the face of chaos. Time seemed to drag. 10 seconds felt like minutes. The roar of the flames drowned out almost all other sounds, but every now and then a louder noise, like a wall collapsing, drew muffled screams from the crowd. The mother, upon hearing these sounds, threw herself to the ground, begging tearfully for someone to help her, but no one had the courage to cross the flames. It was as if everyone was paralyzed, trusting the lives of the little boy and the soldier to an uncertain fate. Then a deeper groan echoed from the structure like an ominous warning. The entire house seemed to tilt for a second, its walls creaking like bones about to snap. A crack sliced through the side, and the crowd instinctively backed away, fearing imminent collapse. A heavy silence fell over the street, as if even the air had held its breath. Everyone waited, suspended between faith and despair, for the outcome they still didn't know whether it would be salvation or tragedy. And at that exact moment, amid the smoke dancing in the air and the crack of the beams giving way, a small flash of light appeared near the side of the house. The crowd's eyes fixed on the same spot, unable to believe it. The mother's heart nearly stopped when she saw the shadow of a man emerging with something in his arms. But the dense smoke made the image blurry, almost illusory, and no one could tell if it was truly the soldier with the child or just a misleading reflection of the fire. From the thick smoke, the figure materialized like a specter, at first just a jagged silhouette that made everyone's hearts race. It was him. The soldier, covered in soot, his uniform plastered with sweat and burns, emerged from the burning darkness. In his arms, clutched to his chest, was the boy, wrapped in a charred blanket, but alive, his eyes half closed, and his frail body shuddering with every movement. The scene seemed impossible, a portrait of heroism against the cruelest backdrop. For an instant, time froze. The mother, recognizing the small figure, let out a scream that seemed to mix pain, relief, and disbelief. She darted a few steps forward, but was restrained by neighbors who feared the imminent collapse of the structure. Michael didn't stop. His eyes burned, nearly closed by the smoke, but his determination was stronger than the pain. Each step seemed to cost him a piece of his life. The side door through which he had broken through was partially blocked by the debris that continued to crumble. He lifted his shoulder and, with the last of his strength, cleared enough space to slip through. The child whimpered softly, a sound that, to the crowd, was like heavenly music. It was proof that there was still life. But fate rarely allows easy victories. A deafening crash echoed as a main beam snapped, and part of the ceiling began to collapse directly on them. The crowd screamed, the mother nearly fainted in terror, and Michael, in an almost superhuman reflex, threw himself forward, using his own body as a shield for the boy. The impact was brutal. Fragments of wood and chunks of concrete struck his back and shoulders, making him groan. But he didn't let go of the child. Even on his knees, even injured, his instinct was to protect the little one at all costs. The shocked crowd didn't know whether to run toward him or retreat, faced with the risk of the house collapsing completely. A younger neighbor, perhaps inspired by the courage he'd witnessed, took a few steps forward, ready to help, but was held back by others, shouting that the structure could give way at any moment. And in the midst of this indecision, Michael, his body aching and his muscles burning, stood up again. The boy was still firmly in his arms, his small fingers curled around the necklace hanging from the soldier's neck. The image was simultaneously devastating and sublime. He stood as if defying death itself, carrying in his arms the reason for his struggle. Each second seemed eternal. The dust mixed with smoke made it difficult to see what was happening, but when he finally managed to move beyond the doorframe and set foot on the sidewalk, a collective cry of relief erupted from the street. The impossible had happened. The boy was saved. However, the moment of triumph did not come without a price. No sooner had Michael stepped through the exit than a second, more violent crash echoed. and the part of the house he had just passed through collapsed completely, engulfing any possibility of return in fire and ash. The crowd backed away in panic. The mother lunged forward, nearly tripping, and finally reached her son in the soldier's arms. She took him in desperation, hugging him as if to fuse him back to her own body, her tears wetting the boy's dirty face. But even in this reunion, her eyes couldn't help but fixate on the figure of the soldier before her. Exhausted, wounded, his eyes clouded with pain, but still standing, like a solitary pillar that had withstood the collapse of the world around him. The improvised hero was breathing heavily, his shoulders bleeding, but there was a strange serenity in his expression, the serenity of someone who had fulfilled the duty that fate had imposed upon him. The moment Michael walked through the door with the boy, it was as if time had stopped. The street air, still hot and heavy with smoke, seemed infinitely purer than any breath inside that burning prison. He could barely breathe, his chest burning, but the sight of the open sky was confirmation that they had traversed the impossible. But fate wasn't finished with its cruel spectacle. As soon as their feet touched the asphalt sidewalk, a crash shook the entire block. The weakened structure of the house finally gave way, collapsing with a roar of wood and concrete that echoed like thunder. The flames rose even higher, engulfing the roof and sending up a dense cloud of ash that covered everyone for an instant. The impact was so strong that the crowd instinctively retreated, some falling to the ground, others taking cover behind parked cars. The scene looked like a war scene, not a peaceful neighborhood. And in the midst of it all, Michael remained standing, staggering. The boy still clutched tightly in his arms, as if refusing to let go even after the fight was already won. The mother, now in tears of relief, snatched her son from his arms and pressed him to her chest. She kissed his forehead repeatedly, whispering desperate promises that she would never leave him again. His entire body trembled, but his soul seemed to have found a second chance he had never expected. The boy, still stunned, sobbed softly, his half-closed eyes fixed on his mother as if confirming that, despite everything, she was still there. Meanwhile, Michael staggered back a step. The weight that had once seemed light now turned into tons of exhaustion. His back throbbed with the pain of the blows he'd received, and his arms burned with burns that were beginning to reveal themselves beneath the soot. He placed one hand on his knee, bending over to breathe, and for a moment the world around him seemed to spin. Yet he didn't fall. His discipline, honed over years of battle, kept him upright, even when his body screamed for the house to crumble. The crowd erupted in nervous applause and screams of euphoria. Some wept, others embraced, as if they all shared the same victory. One of the neighbors approached to support Michael by the arm, but he subtly declined, standing firm, though unsteady. His eyes were not on the audience, nor on the smoking ruins. They were only on the boy and his mother, united in an embrace that carried both pain and redemption. Behind them, the house was no longer a house. It was just a twisted skeleton, a monument of destruction that reminded them how close they had all been to tragedy. The smell of burning permeated the air, and each crackle of the embers seemed a cruel reminder that if they had waited a few more seconds, the outcome would have been completely different. In that brutal contrast, the thin line between life and death became clear to all. One more second, one hesitation, and the child would have disappeared forever into the ashes. One wrong move, and the soldier would be among the wreckage, another name on an invisible list of forgotten heroes. But against all odds they were there, breathing, alive, and that knowledge, more than anything else, made the hearts on that street beat in unison. Michael looked up one last time at the self-consuming flames, as if silently saying goodbye to something only he understood. It was as if he were burying, along with the house, parts of his past that had always haunted him. In that moment, the war within him found a perfect reflection. Destruction on all sides, but also the rare chance to rescue a life and restore hope where there had been only despair. Their embrace seemed bigger than the world. The mother wrapped her arms around the boy, as if trying to sew back together a piece torn from her own heart, rocking her body, whispering his name through tears, promising everything she hadn't promised before. The little boy, his face smeared with soot, buried himself in her neck and breathed in sobs, clutching her with trembling fingers as if afraid the ground would open up and separate them again. There was a distant sound of sirens finally approaching, but in that dome of arms and tears, Time seemed to move at a different speed. The world burned behind them, and yet, at that exact spot on the sidewalk, there was a silence no one dared break. The neighbors, previously a confused chorus of fear, fell silent as if before an altar. A woman covered the mother's shoulders with a coat. A man offered water. Another tried to wipe the boy's face with a cloth. But the mother, clutching her son tightly, barely noticed the gentle hands around her. Her gaze, when she finally raised her head, sought the soldier and found him a few steps away, standing like a tall shadow before the fire. He was hunched over, hands on his knees for a moment, gasping for air, and then straightened with that stubbornness the living have when they refuse to faint. Blood had traced 2 paths down his back, running down through the soot. On his neck, the metal plate beat lightly against his chest, marking the irregular rhythm of his breathing. It was then that the true weight fell upon her. The guilt arrived, undisguised, and the relief that burned in her skin suddenly became overwhelming. On one side of her soul, the miracle; on the other, the implacable mirror of what she had left behind when she ran. Her eyes, so full of gratitude, held a reflection of shame that made her lower her face whenever she looked at Michael. Her hand stroked the boy's hair as if in a wordless prayer, and when she tried to say thank you, her voice faltered on the first syllable. The soldier responded with a tiny nod, as if the word had already been delivered, and perhaps it was. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, took a deep breath, took a step, and stopped. His body demanded rest, but his posture refused to be the center of any scene. The hero the block saw was, to him, just a man doing what needed to be done. The vehicles pulled to a stop with a jolt of gravity, tires squealing, doors slamming, brief instructions piercing the air. The firefighters advanced like precise choreography, hoses opening rivers in the asphalt, the jet of water rising violently and finally taming the roar of the dying house. A paramedic came quickly to the mother, knelt, opened the case, and placed the small mask on the boy's face. The oxygen whispered a new comfort, something between a machine and a miracle. The little boy resisted for a second, frightened, but his mother held his hand and nodded, urging, "It's to help you, my love." He relented, tired, and closed his eyes as if listening to a song. Another paramedic approached Michael and held out a thermal blanket. He hesitated, not out of pride, but out of habit. Soldiers learn to say, "I'm fine," even when their skin screams otherwise. The nurse insisted with practical sweetness, "It'll hurt tomorrow. Let's move the pain forward to today, the right way." He smiled half-heartedly, a brief gesture of surrender, and allowed them to clean the cut on his shoulder. When the IV drip touched his skin, the sting brought a flash of memory, and he looked away like someone refusing to return to an old place. He chose to look straight ahead, where his mother now watched him, not as one might look at a statue, but as one might look at someone who will forever carry a part of us. She stood, trembling, the boy cradled close, the mask hissing softly. He took one step, then another, until the distance between them was an arm's length. "You didn't apologize. There was no way to wrap that guilt in words. You just said finally what you could. If he's here, it's because of you." And there was the whole truth, as simple as the smoke rising into the sky. Sometimes the hand that fails is the same one that learns to hold again. Michael nodded slowly, and the nod brought forth something unnamed, a kind of peace that doesn't make noise. Her gratitude spilled over into a softer cry, the kind that digs and washes at the same time, and he didn't turn away. He accepted it like one receiving water in cracked earth. The firefighters announced that the fire was contained. A light breeze blew through the street, carrying the bittersweet smell of wet wood and unfulfilled promises. The midday light found its way between the clouds and landed on the metal of the soldier's name tag, as if signing the scene with a brief glow. The mother then brought the boy closer to Michael, and the little boy raised his hand to touch the necklace. "He likes this," she said, almost pleading. Michael bent his neck, and the boy, with the seriousness of a 3-year-old, returned the touch as if returning a secret. The guilt on the mother's face didn't disappear, but it took on a different hue, that of a responsibility that, from that moment on, she would choose to carry awake. And the silence that hung there wasn't the silence of shame. It was the silence of something only understood when life, by a hair's breadth, decides to stay. Michael remained standing, but every fiber of his body screamed for rest. The blood no longer flowed as before, but stained the fabric of his torn shirt in dark hues, clinging to his burning skin. The paramedics around him spoke hurriedly, urging him to sit down, to accept the IV, the stretcher, the ambulance. But he shook his head, stubborn as ever, repeating that he was fine. It was an old habit on the battlefield. Admitting pain was giving way to weakness, and he had learned to survive by masking his suffering. Inside, however, the pain was sharp, burning as hot as the fire he had just faced. Each breath came short, ragged, as if smoke was still trapped in his lungs. The street, now filled with patrol cars, had become an involuntary stage. Firefighters, police officers, and paramedics came and went, but the neighborhood's eyes were fixed on him. It was as if this soldier were suddenly living proof that there was still courage in the world. Some approached to thank him, shaking his hand respectfully, calling him a hero. An elderly woman kissed his forehead, crying softly. A middle-aged man murmured that the neighborhood would never forget him. And Michael, his eyes clouded, simply nodded, accepting those words as one accepts invisible medals. But deep inside, the title of hero rang hollow. He knew the weight of victories that cost more than they seemed. He knew that behind every life saved lay scars no one saw, sleepless nights where silence became the enemy, memories that returned like bullets. Now, even in the face of recognition, his heart was heavy. Not out of regret. He would never regret entering that house. But because he carried alone the memory of death's proximity, the same one that had whispered to him so many times on the battlefield, his distant gaze revealed it. It wasn't just there on the sidewalk of an American street, but in all the battles he'd lived through, in all the faces he couldn't bring back. The mother, still hugging her son, approached once more. She wanted to say more than the thank you that had already escaped her lips, but she couldn't. There was an invisible barrier between them, the barrier of an unpayable debt. How could she thank a man who had given his own body to the fire to right the wrong she had committed? The words stuck in her throat. She touched his arm gently, as if to offer him some warmth in return for what he had given. Michael responded with a tired half-smile, and that was it. One of the paramedics, noticing his resistance, finally persuaded him to sit on the step of a patrol car. Michael relented, not for his own sake, but to stop the insistence. As the gauze covered his shoulders and the strong smell of antiseptic wafted up, he closed his eyes for a moment. He didn't see the street, didn't hear the distant applause. He saw, in his mind, the dust of other collapsing houses, the screams of other innocents who were never saved. The past never left him, and in that moment he understood that rescue wouldn't heal his invisible wounds. It would only add another layer to the burden he already carried. Yet something was different. When he opened his eyes again, he saw the boy looking at him, now tearless, breathing better, with the oxygen mask on his face. And in that look, there was something no medal, no speech could give him, the purity of a life that continued. It was in that moment that Michael understood that perhaps it wasn't about heroism, nor about redemption, but about allowing a small heart to keep beating. That alone was worth all the pain he felt. The following hours transformed the tragedy into a story that spread by word of mouth. The block, once a common sight on an American morning, became the center of attention for the entire city. News trucks arrived, microphones were set up, cameras captured every detail of the still smoldering ruins. The smell of burning wood mingled with that of grass, wet with firefighters' water. And in the air was a strange mix of mourning and celebration. The house was lost, reduced to ashes, but a life had been saved, and that was enough to transform grief into symbol. The story of the soldier who risked everything for a strange child spread quickly. In the city's cafes, between sips of coffee and open newspapers, the topic was the same: courage. Some said it was instinct, others asserted that only someone trained in war could act like that. There were those who reflected silently, comparing the soldier's actions to their own ability to face danger. Would I have done the same? That was the question that spread among neighbors, on the streets, in glances. And this question carried an uncomfortable weight. The line between running inside or staying outside had never been so clear. At the nearby school, teachers shared with students what had happened. They spoke of sacrifice, of bravery, but also of the fragility of life. Children drew with colored pencils the moment a man emerged from the smoke with a boy in his arms, as if it were a scene from a movie. To them, Michael wasn't just a soldier, he was a superhero. But for the adults, there was a deeper understanding, the notion that heroes don't have capes, only scars. In the city center, a pastor mentioned the episode in his Sunday sermon. He said that God puts the right people in the right places, and that faith is often manifested through human hands. He compared the soldier's act to ancient parables, reminding us that the greatest love is that of someone who lays down their life for others. Many worshippers wept, not only because of the miracle of a life saved, but because they recognized in that story a reflection of everything humanity should be and so often fails to be. Meanwhile, Michael remained silent. He wasn't seeking applause, nor did he want to be remembered as a hero. He felt that all the attention around him was like an uncomfortable shadow. He knew that if he hadn't survived, he would have been just another name mentioned for a few days and then forgotten. Heroes, he thought, weren't those who made headlines, but those who continued to carry within themselves the invisible weight of their choices. The mother, still in shock, was now the target of divided glances. Some embraced her, offering comfort and support, reminding her that the trauma could have erased her consciousness at the moment of the explosion. Others silently judged her, wondering how a mother could run and leave her son behind. This silent tension permeated the neighborhood, showing that the line between guilt and forgiveness was also tenuous. Still, everyone recognized, without the soldier, there would be nothing to mourn or judge, only an irreparable void. The city learned something that day, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to face it, that cowardice and heroism are not extremes separated by an ocean, but neighbors separated by a single step, and that, in the end, what defines an entire life can be a single moment in which one chooses to enter a burning house. Michael didn't say any of this out loud, but the awareness of choice was evident in his expression. The entire town saw him as an unlikely hero, but he simply saw himself as a man who couldn't back down, and perhaps that was what made him different, his inability to leave anyone behind. Night fell early in that neighborhood, as if the sky also wanted to rest after the day when everything was nearly lost. The smell of smoke still lingered. The streets were damp from the firefighters' incessant work, and the house, or what was left of it, remained a twisted skeleton, illuminated by the intermittent flashing of the fire engines. The crowd had already dispersed, but the echo of that story would remain etched in every resident. The silence was now thick, and within it rested the weight of what had happened. The mother sat on the step of a neighboring house, her son sleeping in her lap. The boy was breathing deeply, now more stable, clutching the same charred toy that had survived the fire. She watched him with red eyes, stroking his hair as if to make up for all the mistakes of that day in one gesture. The guilt wouldn't leave her alone. She could still hear the sound of the explosion, feel the heat of the fire behind her, remember the exact moment she had fled and left her son behind. That weight would stay with her forever. But alongside this pain was something greater, the knowledge that someone had placed her own life on a line she herself had not had the strength to cross. Michael stood a little way off, leaning against a tree, covered by the thermal blanket the paramedics insisted on giving him. His gaze was fixed on the ruins of the house, as if he saw in them not only the physical collapse, but also the rubble he carried within. His body throbbed with pain. Every muscle clamored for rest, but his mind was silent. And in this silence, old memories came like unwelcome visitors, the companions he couldn't save, the innocents who fell by the wayside, the invisible marks of a life dedicated to fighting the impossible. But there was something different that night. He looked at the sleeping boy, so small and fragile, and felt that, for once, he had won the battle he had lost so many times in the past. That child was breathing because he had chosen to enter when everyone else remained outside. There was no medal, there was no parade, but there was life, and that was enough. His mother stood slowly, walking toward him with unsteady steps. She stood before Michael, still holding her son, and for a moment she didn't know what to say. The simplest words seemed too small for the enormity of what he had done. She took a deep breath and her voice breaking said simply, "I didn't deserve to have him saved, but you came in and brought him back. How am I supposed to carry this?" Her eyes were filled with tears, but they weren't just from pain. There was a deep recognition there, a belated awakening of responsibility. Michael watched her in silence. Then he placed his hand on her shoulder and replied softly, "Don't think about what you didn't do. Think about what you're going to do from now on. He needs all of you." That was it. A simple phrase, but it felt like a sentence and a salvation at the same time. His mother understood that this was true karma. Not punishment for what she failed to do, but the duty to transform this second chance into something greater. The boy, still asleep, stirred slightly and clutched the metal collar hanging from the soldier's chest. The tag jingled in the silence of the street, and Michael, for a moment, felt that innocent gesture was like a silent absolution, a sign that the sacrifice had transformed into something beyond pain. He smiled almost imperceptibly, a smile that was not of victory but of peace. Days later, when the story had spread throughout the city, many were still talking about the hero who had saved the child. But for Michael, the true outcome wasn't in the headlines. It was in that small touch on his name tag, in that look of silent gratitude, in that vow the mother made to herself to never again forget what truly mattered. Karma hadn't manifested itself in the form of tragedy, but in the form of a lesson. Neither of them would ever be the same after that morning. And so, amidst the ashes of a destroyed house, 3 new destinies were born. The boy who would live without fully understanding the day the fire nearly took him away. The mother, who would forever carry the guilt and redemption of having been saved by the courage of another. And Michael, who would find in the rescue of that life a fragment of redemption for the battles that always haunted him. The street returned to silence, but everyone knew. In that place, a soldier and a child had written a story that the city would never forget. And if this story touched you in any way, if at any point you held your breath along with that mother or felt the silent pain of that soldier, I invite you to like and subscribe to the channel. This simple gesture helps us continue bringing you stories that touch our hearts and make us reflect on choices, sacrifices, and second chances. Write in the comments what you would have done in her place or in his place. Your opinion could open the eyes of many. And don't forget, in the next video, a new story of courage, pain, and destiny will surprise you even more, and perhaps make you rethink everything you believe about justice and the price of our decisions.